Thank you, one and all. It's Max or either or works for me. It's been a joke. It's going my whole life. I want to ask everyone if you would please silence your cell phones before we get started. We don't want any robots to chirp in the middle of our conversation at all. So thank you for doing that. Thank you, Catherine, for that warm welcome, and thank you all for coming here. These are wonderful forums, and CPH, Carolina Public Humanities, is delighted to have been part of many of these Consider This forums. We want to thank everyone at the GAA, including, of course, Catherine Nichols out front, Jack Ahern, and Marcy Lee Moore, both of whom we work on numerous projects. So, including coming up in February, don't miss out the wonderful joint GAA-CPH collaboration on Oscars night at the Varsity Theater. It's a tradition we've been doing for several years, so please come out and check that out. She already told you who I am. I'm the executive director of Carolina Public Humanities. I might briefly say you should go to humanities.unc.edu if you're interested in our programming. We will have all of our spring programming up online next week. You kind of caught us right in between fall and spring, but by next week all of our offerings will be available. So if you want to get on board and log in tonight and just wait for those, you can do that if you want. Maybe you could develop AI to do that. So let me give you a brief idea of what we're going to do tonight. Each speaker will give a brief presentation. We'll have a brief cross-examination between the five of us up here. And then we're going to open up the floor to questions. And what we are doing for questions is we are soliciting them on paper from the audience. So please, we'll have Catherine going around and she can collect any questions you have. This allows us to get actually to more questions than we would otherwise, because a lot of them maybe are asking the same thing. We can combine them and whatnot. So we have some questions already that have been submitted, and we'll have others for you. I just want to quickly say, why would a humanist want to be involved in this discussion of a very, very STEM topic? And that's because we are interested in minds and intelligence in the past and in today, and we enjoy pondering the implications of having a mind and answering this question, what should we do with these minds of ours? And our answer is to engage with topics of human interest using these humanistic tools of dialogue and reflection, which we're going to do, all of us in this room are going to do that today. And that's exactly what we're doing tonight. So it's a perfect forum for the humanities. Let's briefly meet our panelists. We want to welcome Dr. Mohit Bansal. He's Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Director of the UNC NLP Lab, which is Natural Language Programming. Processing. I knew I had it right. So let's welcome Mohit Bansal, ladies and gentlemen. Let's welcome Peter Koklanis. He's the Albert R. Newsom Distinguished Professor of History and a Director of the Global Research Institute at UNC. And he's going to be a speaker at a humanities event next semester. That's a preview. Welcome, Peter Koklanis. We want to welcome Jonas Monast. He is an inaugural C. Boyd and Gray Distinguished Fellow at Carolina Law School. He also directs the Center on Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics. Please welcome Jonas Monast. And finally, we want to welcome Daniel Cocatello. He is a fourth-year PhD student at UNC, specializing in formal epistemology and decision theory. And a lot of his work is, well, not about human minds, but thinking about the implications of computer minds. Please welcome Daniel Cocatello. And so, without further ado, we'll welcome our first speaker, Mohit Bansal. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, looks like an exciting event. So I didn't prepare slides. I assumed it's, like you said, more of a dialogue. So what I'll do is I made some notes to share with you. So I'm basically a professor in artificial intelligence, right? So we work on building models or machine learning systems that can perform learning-based tasks similar to humans. So by that, what I mean is there's this whole area called natural language processing, which can be thought of as artificial intelligence or machine learning on text. So basically, we do things, we build machines that can understand human language and text, and also generate human language. So I'll give you some examples. And then we also connect language, we build machines that can connect language to vision, right? So images and videos, as well as to robotic actions. So I'll give you, first of all, maybe in my 7 to 8 minutes, I'll give you some of the success examples of AI and machine learning around us first, right? What do we see and use every day that is AI or machine learning? And then I'll go into what might be some negatives and risks that we need to think about as of today. and how are we fixing or trying to fix some of these issues, right? So that would be probably the spectrum that one should cover when talking about AI. From our lab, for example, some of the things we work on in AI is one recent topic we've done is called video captioning. So this is an example where you can take a random on-the-fly video on your phone or from YouTube, and we build models that can automatically describe in words what the description of that video is, right? What are the events and the objects, right, in the video. So that, for example, you can imagine its use cases, right? You could, so there is a simpler version of this task called image captioning. Instead of video captioning, you describe a static image instead of a video. So Microsoft and other places recently converted this to an app where a person with, say, visual disability could have their phone out taking pictures, right? And then the phone could explain to them verbally what they are seeing, right? So that's one example, which we have some very strong systems on in our lab called video captioning. Another thing we work on is called dialogue modeling or conversational systems. So these are all around us, right? I'm sure everyone in this room has used or heard of Alexa, Siri, Google Home, right? So these are NLP systems using machine learning and AI. What they do is they can understand your conversation, what you're talking about, right? So understand the language first and then generate language to respond to you. So we do the academic versions of these, which can look at very, very long conversations, understand the context in them, remember the important parts of the conversation. And we also connect these dialogue models in our lab to things like images and videos. So that the dialogue model should not just be listening to your conversation to understand the conversation, but should also be able to, if you allow it, there's privacy issues, but if you say press the button, it should, there may be a video on your Alexa so that it can actually also see the surroundings that you are in, right? When we talk as humans, we share visual surroundings. We don't explicitly say everything in words, right? We assume a lot of shared knowledge, a lot of shared visual surroundings. So we are building, these are known as multimodal conversational systems, which mean that can we build dialogue agents that use verbal conversation context, but also visual context around you to have a better conversation with you, right? So this can also have a lot of social use cases, and people are using them for this. So we have collaborations, for example, with ongoing with the disability faculty at UNC, where we are saying, can we use our dialogue systems to suggest responses to someone with verbal disability or someone who has speech impairment, right? Can we suggest responses to them if they are slow in responding to conversations? Humans, right? Human folks with disability. We also recently had a rank 1 system for this task called fake news detection, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, fake news, right? So this is another example of machine learning being useful. So we have a system recently, there was a worldwide competition from 25 teams, universities, and industry teams from around the world, where the competition was to build a machine that can best detect fake news, right? So we got the rank 1 on this from our lab, and the idea was that we don't just predict whether something is fake news or not, because that's just a label, right? Why would you trust that? But the idea was to make it interpretable, explainable. Why did the machine think this is fake news or real news? So give evidence behind that decision. So this is a big part of how the AI and machine learning community, by the way, we'll go into that later, is trying to fix or improve machine learning by making things interpretable and explainable, right? We have a lot of deep learning models these days. There's this whole area of machine learning called deep learning, which uses neural networks. So these are specific types of models that were supposed to mimic the human brain, but people don't really want to have that analogy for now. But the idea is that these are very black box in nature. There's a lot of layers of parameters that are used to define the label, the decision. But now we are working on how to make these models more explainable, so that they don't just give a decision, but they explain their decision, right? That can lead to a lot of ethics and fairness, because then if it makes a wrong decision for something like gender bias or race bias, the model can actually explain why it made that decision. What features did it use in the input to make that decision, so that we can fix the model, right? Yeah, so just to, I'm running out of time.
Oh, you're great, you're good.
But just to finish the examples of AI around you, there's tons of things, right? So have you been using Gmail recently, right? So Gmail, you might have noticed, has started auto-completing your replies, or at least suggesting auto-completion of your email. So that's one of my colleagues at Google. Then there's things like old things like spam detection, obviously in your email. There is things, even Google search engine, that's basically a very big machine learning system. So basically then there is things like recommendation systems on Amazon, on Netflix, on Pandora, right? Music recommendation, all of these things that you're amazed by that, hey, how does it realize that I like this kind of stuff and it shows me better things? This has been around for a while. This is recommendation systems, which is a sub-community of machine learning. There's the whole aspect of autonomous driving, which obviously a lot of you have heard of. And then there is a lot of aspects of medical image analysis, which means that we are building machines, a lot of very good people in the computer science department here, on can we use brain images or body images from inside the human body to automatically detect cancerous tumors? Can we use video behavior to detect autism directly by finding certain patterns in human behavior? So there's a lot of very successful examples recently. We've done some new work on can we use some person's speech and text to be able to detect Alzheimer's dementia early, right? We had this new paper on can we take someone's online stories and classify that this was sexual harassment, right? So that they can be automatic filling of police reports, and then the victims right? So there's this promotion that, hey, like, let's fill the reports early and let's have the culprits be caught. And then lastly, there's this whole angle of connecting language and vision to robotics. So we are working on things, and other people in our community, on can we give instructions to robots so that they can do things for us, right? The whole kind of pop culture image of a robot working around you in your home, right? So can we tell it navigational instructions, go to the corner of the room, pick up the book in my bedroom, bring it back to me. So we have some early models on this where we can say instructions for assembling things on a table or cooking a recipe, and the robot, it goes from language all the way to action in a robot. So that would be a summary. I think we'll probably discuss the more aspects of the negatives.
Okay, we'll have plenty of opportunity to get into all of that. So thank you, Mohit Bansal. Thank you. Next up is Peter Koklanis.
Thank you, Mohit. Is this on? Can you hear? Oh, I'm an economic historian, not a forecaster or a futurist or anything like that, and I think my comments will reflect my disciplinary perspective as well as my instincts and temperament. Now, I see, for many of us, I think artificial intelligence, or AI, is something of a squishy and somewhat ambiguous concept. And here I'll be employing the term AI in my comments tonight, really in light of what is increasingly known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, kind of coined this term a number of years ago. But basically, the first industrial revolution was in the late 18th century through much of the 19th century, and that was textiles, steam, and steam power and iron. After that, there was another second industrial revolution, which basically came about as an acceleration and intensification of the first, but this one brought in technologies, particularly electricity and steel, oil, internal combustion engine, stretched about till 1950. The third is basically the rise of computers and digitalization, if you trace it back to the 40s and going through the 80s. But this fourth industrial revolution, the one we're talking about today, is basically the one that Mohit has just talked about. Basically, this era can be said to really connote the emergence and then convergence of a variety of digital technologies that had emerged in this third industrial revolution. And this brings together increasingly things like AI, robotics, machine learning, quantum computing, 3D printing, nanotechnology, the so-called Internet of Things. And some people would push it to talk about genetic biotech advances, self-driving or autonomous vehicles and things like that. All of these are considered by many to be disruptive technologies. As a historian, we've seen a lot of supposedly disruptive technologies going back to the invention of the discovery of fire and the Neolithic Revolution, in which people began to domesticate plants and animals, and going all through history with the wheel, the stirrup, gunpowder, electricity, steam, railroads, telegraphy, and all of these types of things. One of the unexpected finds by one of the great historians of technology, Vaclav Smil, is that none of these really were as disruptive as the discovery of a process for making synthetic nitrogen, basically ammonia, which when used in the form of fertilizer between 1900 and 2000 allowed us to feed a growing population from 1.6 billion to about 6 billion people, and no one's even recognized that technology in the mainstream. Now, it's important to remember when we're contextualizing AI and this revolution we're going through that this is not the first disruptive technology, and this is not the first time we've had these fears and scares about job replacement, job displacement, and job loss as a result of technology. Queen Elizabeth I in 1598 banned basically a type of loom because she thought it was going to put too many workers out of work. Many of you are familiar with the Luddites in the early 19th century who went around breaking steam-powered mills in England in the early 19th century. Some of you probably have read Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week type of books that he's made a fortune on. But John Maynard Keynes wrote an essay in 1930 called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he claimed that they would be working 15-hour weeks maximum. None of this has come true. Basically, when we look at AI from an economic point of view, we can break down everyone into two camps, pessimists and optimists. Most technologists on the economic front are pessimists. They believe that we're going to lose a lot of jobs. A lot of people aren't going to have jobs going forward. There have been a lot of celebrated reports that have talked about 40 to 50% of present-day jobs will be gone in the future. Economic historians and economists are generally optimists, and they say that in the past, that every time we've had a disruptive technology, many jobs are lost, but more are created, and because of the economic growth engendered, people have more disposable income and new wants. So 20 years ago, no one knew that we would have personal trainers and career coaches and things like that. Now we do. Marshall Brain, and I was on a program with Max with him. It's a great name for a technology guru, isn't it, who works on things like robotics and AI. He's at State, and he believes that no one will have a job in about 20 years, and everyone will have to have basically a universal basic income provided by the government. My own position, derived from my disciplinary bias perhaps, is that we will be able to accommodate AI, and I see it as a good thing. I don't think it will be as jarring and dislocating as some feel. I think everyone in this room will be able to accommodate it okay going forward. I don't believe that this time is different arguments. I think that in the past it has taken a long time to accommodate new technologies. Electricity was around from the 1880s. It didn't really show up in factories till the 1920s. Computers have been around since the 40s. Economic historians who measure the impact of digitalization have said it shows up everywhere but in the productivity statistics. Peter Thiel, who you probably know, the entrepreneur, has made this famous quote about they promised flying cars and we got 140 characters. Basically, we got Twitter. So I'm not sure about the short-term implications of this type of technology. I'm not pessimistic in the long run. I think it will change things. Some groups will be more at risk than others, but I take the more optimistic position that we will create more jobs and a better future for more people as a result.
We like optimistic historians. Peter Kuklanis, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Next up, Jonas Monas, take it away.
Okay, great. So if you look at my bio in the little flyer, it will probably become very apparent very quickly. I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence. It's not what I write about. It's not what I study. But I'm here on this panel because I do study other examples of emerging technologies and the governance challenges created by emerging technologies. And I think that for some of the examples that I study, there are some direct parallels to artificial intelligence. So I thought I would offer a few kind of broad comments about emerging technology governance generally, and then talk about where I see I think some pretty big challenges for artificial intelligence specifically. Okay, when I say emerging technologies, so I'm lumping artificial intelligence, financial tech, biotechnology, CRISPR, right, gene drive technologies, nanotech. So a number of these technologies that are emerging. They're emerging very quickly. They offer the promise for tremendous societal benefit, but also the uncertain risk of tremendous societal harm, and it creates a question, right? So from the governance perspective, what I mean here is not just regulation. What I mean here is who sets the rules for how a technology is going to evolve, right? Is this going to be the experts who understand the technology and are the ones developing it? Is it going to be others of us who may have strong opinions about the technology, right? Or strong opinions about the way that we live, and we may prefer not to have machines taking over human jobs, right? Is it going to be a democratic process or not? And so for emerging technologies, for each of this suite of technologies, including artificial intelligence, one major challenge that scholars point to in the governance field is the pacing problem. Our legislative system, right, even when it works well, which I think we could probably have a long conversation about whether it's working well right now, and if not, why not? But even when it's working well, it's designed to go very slowly. Our regulatory system, so after Congress or the state legislature passes a law, the executive branch, when figuring out how to implement the law and enforce the law, is designed to go very slowly. It's designed to be transparent. It's designed to be methodical. It's designed to be participatory in many ways. So when you're talking about emerging technologies, if it's a 2 to 4 year lawmaking and regulatory process from start to finish, by the time you finish, whatever decision has been made may be utterly obsolete, and you may have to start over because the technology has evolved as quickly as it has. Another question in the governance space is how much do we want to err on the side of precaution versus how much do we want to err on the side of innovation? And again, who makes that choice? Here in the United States, in a lot of instances with technology, we tend to err on the side of innovation. We tend to have faith that as risks emerge, we have the ability to respond to those risks and make the choice that we want to not overly regulate at the outset to allow technology to emerge because we want to capture the societal benefits. Just with the example of genetically modified organisms, the contrast between how the United States treats GMOs, which we treat it as inherently not dangerous, and if one aspect of GMOs is dangerous, we will then regulate that. Compare that to Europe, where the starting point is we're going to presume that it is dangerous from the outset and wait until we have more information before we adopt the technology. Another challenge with artificial intelligence, and I think shares this trait with biotechnology, is a lot of the innovations may not be at all visible to regulators to begin with. Right? So it's not like this is GE that's doing it, or GE's doing it, but not the only ones doing it, or big manufacturers. It may be much more diffuse. The innovations are taking place in areas that, laboratories across the world where it may be much harder for government regulators to figure out what's happening. And another challenge, I think, in the emerging technology space is there's a pressure for rapid regulatory approval, even to the extent that regulators do have a choice about whether a technology is going to be adopted or not. Just reading some articles about artificial intelligence preparing for this panel, one of the, I think, common arguments against a restrictive regulatory regime when it comes to artificial intelligence is that if we don't do it here in the United States, China will, right? And that means not only losing the economic gains that could come from being the first mover, but there could be national security threats and other kinds of threats as well. So it's happening. We have to say yes before we fully understand. Okay, so I think no slide deck talking about artificial intelligence is complete without at least one picture of the Terminator, right? And maybe this is Peter's optimistic and pessimistic slide here. But so on one side we have this is Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking's comments about AI as an existential threat to humanity, right? On the other side, I don't know if you can see this. This is a cartoon from XKCD, and at the bottom it says, "The moment the computers controlling our nuclear arsenals, the computers controlling our nuclear arsenals became sentient, and what they're doing is they're launching all of our nuclear weapons into the sun, and they're saying, why in the world did you have these things to begin with, right? So artificial intelligence may be able to save us from ourselves. From a legal perspective, asking what is artificial intelligence, I think is one of the fundamental governing challenges, because in the law, whether it be judges or whether it be legislators or whether it be regulators, when there's something new, we try to find the analogy to something old, and we may tweak that old approach given the new thing, but we don't often make up regulatory approaches new out of whole cloth. And the choice that we make about what is artificial intelligence, is it an algorithm? Is it the machine? Is it the company operating the machine? Is it the function that it's serving? Is it a new version of thinking like humans? Any of those understandings of artificial intelligence and choices to say we are now going to, from a legal perspective, we're going to treat it like this and not like that, I think has the potential both to influence how the technology may evolve and also to fundamentally misunderstand how the technology may actually be evolving and where the risks may lie. Okay, so now I'm just going to quickly put up, these are just pictures, just a few examples of how artificial intelligence is already interacting with our lives. Some of you may have a smart speaker in your home, which has already been mentioned, the autonomous vehicles, autonomous weapon systems, financial technology, which can both, artificial intelligence can help root out fraud. It can also root out opportunities to make money on those, the very quick trading margins. The Nest Home Monitor, which has artificial intelligence embedded into it, so it can actually look for things, not just record everything that's happening. Medical technology, this one over here is an interesting one. That's Simon, C-I-M-O-N, was developed by the European Space Agency and is on the International Space Station. And it's basically an AI-enabled assistant. And there's an interesting video online that I just found last week where a German astronaut is interacting with Simon for the first time. And after some back and forth, where I thought the astronaut was actually being pretty nice, Simon says, "Please don't be mean to me." Right, which the astronaut laughed, but I thought it was not what he expected to come from the AI-enabled machine. Okay, so from a legal perspective, just to wrap this up, the law already applies in each of these contexts, right? So for Alexa, there are privacy laws that apply. For the autonomous vehicle, we have laws that say stop at stoplights, right? And so it's not that these AI-enabled devices are not regulated, but AI presents some fundamental challenges, right? So for autonomous vehicles, our laws right now say, right, if you get into so stop at stoplights, if you get into a wreck, a police officer is going to show up and he's going to figure out how to assign fault. You need to have personal insurance because if you are the one at fault, you need to be able to compensate whoever else was harmed. In the artificial intelligence context, right, who's at fault? Is it the designer of the algorithm? Is it the seller of the car? Is it the operator of the car who didn't override the autonomous system? Is it the person who was crossing the street and got hit because that person was not acting in a rational manner the way that the artificial intelligence system would expect a person? I say that in jest, but tort law assumes the reasonable person. And that's kind of the question that we ask. So if AI is designed around rationality and the reasonable person, that if we veer from that and the AI system doesn't recognize it, I think it is a question there. Who's at fault? So I think there's a lot more that we could say about this. And for each one of these examples, I think there's some very hard questions that come up when we're talking about a machine that is making autonomous
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you. And we will get into all of these. Next up, Daniel Cucatello.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. Is this working? I'm going to stand up a bit so I can see my own slides. Let's see. Okay, great. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me. As you know, I'm the philosopher in this group, which means I get to talk about some wild, speculative stuff. So get ready. So Mohit started us off talking about stuff that's happening right now, the present of AI. We've then now seen some of the ethical issues that are brought up by that sort of thing, so legal issues and maybe some stuff about unemployment. I'm going to talk about something that's farther in the future, something that isn't going to happen anytime soon, but that a lot of people think might happen. And I'm going to talk about AI safety. I'm going to talk about the sort of thing that Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and those sorts of people are worried about. What if we all die, right? I don't think we're all going to die, but I think maybe we should be worried about it, and we should maybe think more about it and try to make sure that it doesn't happen. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly overview what this AI safety discipline is and the sorts of things that people think about and why people are doing this in the first place. Okay, so high-level machine intelligence, let's throw out this definition. Unaided machine that can accomplish every task better and more cheaply than humans. So we're far away from this now. Let me give some examples of how we're building towards this, though. Okay, so OpenAI 5. This is a AI that was built in this past year. What does it do? Well, it plays the video game of Dota. You may have heard of it, Dota. It's a popular video game. They made an AI that can do it, and it can do it pretty well. It's not better than the best humans. Here's a track of how good it got over the course of the year. As you can see, it got pretty good pretty fast, thanks to more training data, thanks to more tweaks. It's still not as good as the top professionals, but it's better than most humans by far. Okay, so this is a pretty good AI system. It's better than most humans, but only at one specific thing. All it can do is play Dota. You know, it can't really even think outside that little box that it's in. Here's another recent example. So DeepMind came out with an AI called PopArt Impala. It's exciting because it can do more than one thing. So it can play any Atari game, right? So here's an example of some Atari games, right? It's a single AI system, and it can play all of these games. So here's its scores on the various games. You can see them lined up here. This is a list of all the Atari games. There's some other games besides Atari games over here. It can play all of them, and the little bars show how well it can play them. So 100 right here, that's average human level. So as you can see, it's worse than humans at many of these games, better than humans at many of them. In generally speaking, it's sort of all right, okay? So this is progress. This is an AI that's it's pretty broadly capable. It can't just do one thing, it can do lots of things. And it can do lots of things better than humans can do. But of course, it's still pretty narrow, right? All it can do is play Atari games. That's pretty specific. So, you know, clearly we're pretty far away from getting high-level machine intelligence. We're pretty far away from something that can actually replace a human in any sort of very big, scary sense. Of course, AI progress is fast, so even though we're far away, how far away are we exactly? Well, here's something that might serve as some evidence for an answer. So this is a survey done by my employer, AI Impacts. They went to an AI conference and surveyed all of the AI experts and asked them when they think high-level machine intelligence will arrive. So each of these lines, each of these gray lines on this graph is one of the experts' answers. So what each expert did is draw a line representing the probability that will have happened by then, right? So if you can see right here, there's one person who thinks like, by next year, it's probably going to happen. And then over here, we've got some people who think like, yeah, 100 years from now, it's still like probably not going to happen, right? The main takeaway to get from this data is that like people wildly disagree. There's no consensus at all, at least among AI experts, for when this sort of thing is going to happen. As you can see, there's a bunch of people that think there's a decent chance it'll happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years, right? 25 years from now, there's a whole bunch of people who think there's a decent chance it'll have happened. But then there's also a whole bunch of people who think that, you know, a century from now, it probably won't have happened, right? So we don't really know when this is going to happen, so why think about it now? Yeah, question? Yeah, that's a very interesting fact. For whatever reason, and we don't really know why, AI experts from Asia tend to think it's going to happen sooner than AI experts from North America and Europe. We can speculate about why, but anyhow. So why think about it now? Well, human cleverness resulted in many less intelligent species going extinct. When there are other things smarter than us, maybe we should worry that something similar might happen. Okay, first to dispel some myths. High-level machine intelligence, like any sort of machine intelligence, is going to be built by humans. So it's not going to be some, self-aware competitor species that's going to hate us or anything like that. It won't suddenly, develop a desire to dominate us, because after all, we're going to have built it, and we're going to have built it to help us. We're going to have built it to be cooperative and helpful. But there's a chance we'll mess up, just like there is with anything. Okay, so what is this data? This is also from that survey. They asked the AI experts to say, how good will high-level machine intelligence be for humanity? Each vertical line is an expert. So right here on the left, we have this person here, there's actually a whole bunch of them, who they colored their entire line yellow. That means they think it's 100% chance, extremely good. So here over here we have some AI experts who think 100% chance, extremely good. Here we have some experts who think, maybe 60% chance, extremely good, and then 35% chance on balance good. Over here we have one person who thinks 10% chance on balance bad, 90% chance extremely bad, e.g. human extinction. But they're still working on it, so I wonder what's going on in their heads. Anyhow, the first thing to take away from this is that people working on AI seem to think that it's going to be probably very good. And I think we should take that pretty seriously. I think that probably it will be very good in a lot of ways. There's a whole bunch of yellow on this graph, and then the stuff that's not yellow is mostly this pink here. But the second thing I want to point out is look at all this black down here. Just eyeballing it here, it looks like more than 50% of the AI experts assign at least 5% probability to it's going to be extremely bad, e.g. human extinction. So I think that's an important fact, right? Like, at least 50% of the AI experts polled think that there's some chance that we're all going to die. So that's why I think we should worry about it, even though it's speculative, even though it's far in the future. It's worth at least thinking about it right now. Okay, the rest of the thing I want to do in this talk is I want us to get across the message that we need to sort of avoid two unhelpful extremes. So first, like I was saying, we don't want to be naive about this. Even though this is probably not going to happen, I think we should take seriously the possibility that it might, and we should do things to prepare and try to make sure it doesn't happen. We should do research to try to make sure that when this AI is developed, it's developed in a more responsible manner. On the other hand, we don't want to be Luddites either. We don't want to just start banning or restricting AI technology because of this hypothetical fear. There's so many good things that could come out of this, and we don't want to miss out on those opportunities. And besides, blanket bans and restrictions and things like that often don't even accomplish their own goals. So I'm trying to sort of steer a middle path here, I think is the takeaway. The nightmare scenario for me, as this discussion starts to become a popular discussion and lots of people start thinking about this, is that it becomes polarized. I'm worried that we're going to divide into sort of two extreme camps, with fear mongers seeking to ban or heavily regulate AI research on the one side, and then AI risk deniers on the other side, just sort of papering over the problems and saying that we don't need to worry about it. I think that if the public debate ends up in that situation where there's just sort of two extremes, it's going to be bad for all of us, no matter who turns out to win the debate. So the middle way, we need to avoid the extremes. How do we do that? So I don't think we should ban things. Here's what I think we should do. Get a ton of more people researching these things, like understanding the dangers, figuring out technically how to make AI that's smarter than us and also beneficial, and then collaborating together so that when the time comes, the lessons from these sorts of research get implemented instead of ignored, right? This is roughly speaking what people mean when they talk about AI safety, is they're not talking about banning anything yet, they're talking about just funding and doing this sort of research to make sure that things go well. Okay, here are some examples of research questions within this field. So as I've put them sort of on a spectrum here, some of these questions are definitely questions for AI scientists to think about, not people who don't know much about AI. So for example, how do we ensure that the AI share our goals even when they are significantly smarter than us? That's a technical question. That's a question for whoever's building the thing to figure out how to do that. Number two, this is sort of interdisciplinary. How difficult is that first question? Is it the sort of thing that we should expect to get done in a couple months as long as we have the right people working on it? Or is it the sort of thing that's going to take years and years of careful study such that we should start funding people working on the problem now? You know, even though it's not going to happen for decades. Number three, if we end up making something that's, this is the bad case, right? If we do end up making something that's really smart and that doesn't share our goals, how bad would it be, right? Is it so bad that we need to be putting a lot of effort into making sure it doesn't happen? Or is it just like kind of bad and just one of the things that we should be worrying about, but only one of many things? And then finally, and this is a purely politics question, how can we avoid an arms race, right? We've already talked about this a little bit, but different nations and different companies are already racing to advance this technology. One of the downsides of that is that then they're incentivized to neglect safety. So maybe even if safety isn't that difficult, if they're incentivized to neglect it, then we might screw up anyway. So politically, how can we sort of organize as human beings to make sure that we don't end up in that bad situation? All right, so thanks. The good news is lots of organizations are already working on this. So DeepMind is one of the prominent AI labs right now, so is OpenAI, and they both have AI safety teams working on these sorts of issues. So I don't think that we should be super scared. I want to end on an optimistic note. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. We appreciate a balance of optimism and pessimism on the panel, so it's a great panel. First of all, let's hear for all of our panelists again. Thank you for your contributions. And now we can get into the conversation. You know, there's so many things that strike us about this, and I want to remind you folks, if you do have questions, please get Catherine's attention. She'll come around and grab any questions that you have written out, and we'll start collecting up here. I do have some already. You know, I just want to ask the panel a couple things. As the humanist in me, I love inefficient systems. And I'm wondering about, I use the example of Blockbuster, how we miss Blockbuster movies. When you used to go into the Blockbuster movie and you used to be able to see all of the, or maybe VisArt, I went to VisArt, you see all of the various covers of all of the various movies that are available to you. In the algorithmic world of efficiency, where we now are saying algorithms determining our preferences, we have created systems that privilege efficiency and perhaps lose opportunities for knowledge that's gained through inefficient means and through perhaps completely useless knowledge, if you will. I'm wondering about, and it sort of ties into all of these, but mostly for Mohit and for Daniel to think a little bit, and also somewhat for Jonas to think a little bit about human thinking. What is left of the human in an AI system? Because humans are not rational creatures. For all that law is built on the assumption of rational creatures, we know enough about cognitive neuroscience to know that we're not really that rational. We make all kinds of irrational choices that can lead to good or bad conclusions. So, long story short, anyone want to take up this question about how human are these machines and what are we losing by making these machines think this super efficient way?
All right, sure, I'll take a shot at it. So I think, Mohit would agree with me that right now these machines aren't very human at all, but that's okay. I mean, our cars aren't humans, our brooms aren't humans. We've made all sorts of tools in the past, and it's generally been a good thing for us, even though it's not a human that's doing the task, it's something else now. So I think that there are interesting questions in the long run to think about, right? So currently, when we automate some tasks with machines, there's other tasks that we can switch to. And usually that works out pretty well for us. Maybe in the future that will eventually no longer be the case. I guess this is a question for the economist to think about, but hypothetically in the future we could end up with a machine that just does everything that I can do except much better and cheaper. Then maybe things will be different, but at least for the time being, I would say it's just lots of benefits are going to come from this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the specific example you gave on recommendations, I think it's more a convenience, right? So you are given choices of similar movies that you've seen or music that you've listened to or Amazon products you bought, right? So it's a convenience that you can look at, but I definitely most of the time actually ignore that. So it's not, right? It's not a forced decision. It's a convenience that, okay, these are things you might be interested in, but I still browse brainlessly sometimes just to look for new things that I might be interested in, develop new hobbies. So I think it's a mix of both. It's up to the human, the person, of how much to use that recommendation given by the machine. You can feel free to, but I do agree that in general, if it's being given to us, people will become more accustomed to it and more rely more on it. And then in terms of the second aspect of the question about how much human personality or human these machines are, so that, yeah, that's a pretty fun and open-ended question. So very recently, there's been more and more work on how to try to make machines more human-like, more personality-based. So there's this whole aspect of digital machine learning art, right? So there's a lot of work on automatically creating paintings and right. So some of these things are so subjective that some people think it's totally useless, the art that AI agents are creating. Some people think they're better than what humans do. Same for music. There's been a lot of work on music generation. So this is also subjective, that no one will ever agree on whether this is perfectly better or not. There's also things in dialogue agents. So some of the work we are doing is how to make dialogue models like Alexa and Siri more polite versus more rude. Because there was this big article 2 years ago, or maybe 1 year ago, where Alexa is making your kids rude, right? So the reason was they can talk to it in any way they want. It just does what it wants them to do. So then they start talking to their parents in the same way. So there's like some work looking at that on can it. And then that's also a very open and gray area, right? Because they are very worried about not making these machines your therapists, right? They don't want you to be playing mind games with them and like, oh, if the kid talks to me rudely, should I be rude back? Or like, should I try to teach it politeness? So it's a very, I mean, again, for the, maybe better for the other people on the panel to think more about that. Thanks.
So we don't have Alexa in our house, and I still have that problem with children talking rudely to you. So I think I'm actually going to answer a slightly different question than the one that you asked. But this idea of AI and humanity, I want to just read a paragraph here from a recent Guardian article, which I think, for me, highlights what I think is going to be one of the really difficult ways for government regulators or just governance systems more broadly to deal with artificial intelligence. So this is about a smart car, or an autonomous car that Alibaba was showing off at a trade show. The greatest feature of the car, explained the proud representative, is that its media panel linked to the user's smartphone reads patterns of movement, food choices, and potentially even photos and comments, and then crosses this with millions of data sets to make predictions about what the user might like to eat and how they might like to travel there or have the food travel to them. In short, the new citizen outsources part of their decision-making processes, maybe even part of their desire, to Alibaba. Our very impulses are mapped and planned in advance. The triangulation between data, predictive technology, and desire could be the single most important relationship that is taking us into a dystopian future. Now, that's clearly on the pessimistic side, but I think, I mean, you know, just paying attention to what's happening on the national stage right now, where we're trying to figure out the extent to which Russia may have influenced our elections. We are not anywhere near as resilient to outside influence on our thoughts as we think that we are. And to the extent that artificial intelligence systems can just analyze our patterns, figure out what we like, figure out what may influence us and steer us in some directions rather than others, right? Whether it be Netflix's algorithm suggesting that I would like to watch certain videos, and my father-in-law from Ireland, who watches a lot of British shows, might like to watch other things, right? That's or something more pernicious than that. I think that's going to be a challenge, because those algorithms are going to be analyzing us and suggesting courses of action or even facilitating courses of action for us in a way that is not transparent to us and in a way that we might not even fully recognize the extent of the influence on us. So.
Great. Thank you for your comments. I have so many questions coming up here, so I'm going to I want to first ask the panelists just if there's anything that you heard the other panelists say already that you would like to respond to before I start sorting through all of these questions. Is there anything that you heard in Peter's talk or in Daniel's talk that you want to comment on, or should we get right to the questions? We're getting to the questions. Peter, you're up. Okay, Peter, we had two questions. I'm going to kind of put them together here. One was about education and disruptive technologies, and that is education accessible enough for disruptive technology to lead to a net gain in jobs? And the other is about disruptive technologies and political and social movements. It seems like every one of these industrial revolutions was accompanied by changes in political and social movements, in particular labor movements changing and adapting to more increasingly elaborate industries. So, two questions. Can you see what kind of labor movement or social movement might arise that would be different in response to AI? And can the education system work to prevent disruptive technologies from taking away jobs?
Yeah, those are very good questions. There's a kind of a cottage industry out there about how to, as quote unquote, robot-proof your life. Basically how to acquire the skill set that will allow you not only to survive but to thrive in the coming generations as AI, everyone agrees, will become a bigger part of our life. A lot of people are pushing a certain skill set that you will need, and you've heard a lot about this because it's very prominent in the literature. People are stressing creativity, mental elasticity and flexibility, advanced pattern recognition, more complex forms of communication, adeptness with non-routine tasks, soft skills, emotional IQ, working in teams, things like that. So I think that there are people out there that realize that there are ways to try to minimize your chance of losing out in this revolution that is taking place and will be important going forward. I think it's important, to understand that a lot of the economic historians and economists who are studying this are fairly optimistic that if, with proper government support, individual will, parental help, guidance by educators, that I think we will be able to find a way so that most people in the future will work with machines rather than be displaced or replaced by them. Now the political question, the second question, that's a very interesting one. There's a economist formerly at MIT who's now at the Sanford School, Frank Levy, who has been doing some very interesting work on the differential effects and the unevenness of AI going forward. And while he is relatively optimistic about the long-term future of it, the types of people and jobs that will be replaced earliest are lots of blue-collar jobs, white-collar clerical jobs, low-level middle management jobs, jobs in distribution centers. And he's written a couple pieces arguing that these people are precisely the ones that will be potentially subject to a kind of reactionary populist political programs in the developed countries at least. And so he is warning that while in the long run, and for most people AI might do well, we have to kind of make sure that those who are affected adversely find some accommodation, either through retraining, government supports, maybe basic income support, things like that, or there could be some political difficulties going forward for the rest of society.
Robots of the world unite. I have these four questions are all kind of similar. I'm going to read them or summarize what they are, and I think that each of you might have a perspective on the question. The questions kind of are, what is the current reality or expectations of machines collaborating with each other? Are machines measures taken to prevent the machines from developing their own secret language and begin communicating with each other? What is the difference between AI and machine learning, cognitive computing? Can you give some examples? And then followed by what keeps you up at night about AI? I guess one of the, thinking about how to position this for all of you, but certainly, Mohit, you could certainly speak to where are machines and learning and teaching other machines, and what is where is that going? Jonas, you might think about that aspect of liability. You know, when machines start creating other machines and start working with other machines, where does this lead to that liability question you asked? And of course, Daniel, just so you can scare us with what the implications are of that. So anyone want to take on, I guess we'll start with Mohit, about machine learning and secret languages between machines. And
Actually, yeah, I did have a question for Daniel about the graph later. Like, I'm curious who these 350 machine learning experts were who said we are all going to die with some probability.
I know we're all curious where you are on that list. So
Because that's definitely not the sentiment in our circles. But I'm sure, I mean, this plot is valid. So it would be.
You talking about like these people or these people?
Yeah, like where you said almost everyone has some probability. But I know there might be different sub-communities of ML-related research. So that's a fun question too. But coming back to the secret language, I think that's actually a very valid question, because very recently a group of people, I think there was some work from different industrial labs and academic labs that did try to build a multi-agent model that tries to learn from a language from scratch. And so then they tried to interpret what they're learning, and there was this whole media article about, oh, they've learned their secret language and are going to take over the world. But then when you look closely, it's basically learning very, very, so if you look at it from an academic perspective, the papers are more about, can we make machines start from scratch, unsupervised, right? So zero language learning almost as a newborn child. And then if we make them talk to each other and give them a very few priors, can they learn language? And then is that language similar to human language or different? So there was already so much of expectation on that model that even learning a few certain color words and location words was already a big excitement. But it was definitely not at any level of learning some secret language where they would just start talking in that language and ignore us as humans. So I think in terms of what keeps us up at night, I think we have deadlines, right? So what keeps us up at night is to improve the AI system. So I'm probably seeing it from a different perspective. Oh, can I make my AI system as good as the world usually thinks these things are? But from the other perspective, since we know the details of like how much there is still to be done to make them useful in any real way, in that sense I can sleep pretty well. I think on a more serious note, I think what we need to worry about, like I said very briefly in my 7 minutes, is how to make these machines more explainable. I think that already will solve a lot of issues. If we can, instead of having them as black box systems that just give out a prediction and say, okay, take it or leave it, there's a lot of focus on now trying to make our machine learning systems more explainable. So don't just give us a decision, but explain how you achieved or reached that decision. Explain your thought of chain of reasoning is what it's called. So that's being useful in a lot of ways, and I can give examples later. But I think that's why I think we can sleep a little bit better, because the community has very strongly been focusing on how to make artificial intelligence and machine learning more explainable. So I can give more details about those models, but I think let's hear from other folks first.
Actually, can I ask you a question before we go to, so one of the other applications of artificial intelligence that I'm slightly familiar with is artificial intelligence in the judicial system, right? So figuring out who may be more of a flight risk, so you set bail higher, right? And what factors would the algorithm be paying attention to decide whether somebody is more of a flight risk, or whether somebody is more likely to commit a crime again after the first crime, right? So even if the machine learning system is explaining the decision-making process, would that make it transparent where the bias may be on the part of?
Exactly. So the second step, so there's an example related to yours where there were some really controversial use cases of AI recently, right? So using it to determine who should we give immigration visas to, or there's this big use of AI now on applying it to your resumes and trying to decide who should get the job. So obviously, it should be no surprise what kind of biases will come out here, right? The machine learning system. So I think the bottom line one of the bottom lines or takeaways should be that whenever there is machine learning bias, right, in your model, it's coming from human bias, right? That's one big takeaway that we should have today, is that a lot of these systems, if not all, are trained on data that we created as humans, right? So all these training data that the models are trained on will be things like, okay, a resume and what the decision was, a resume and what the decision was in the past by human recruiters, right? So then it learns that if we had a bias in recruiting certain kinds of folks, then the machine learns that bias. So when we make it explainable, it starts telling us what features it used to reject someone. And then there's a lot of recent work on how to debias. So this is an area called debiasing machine learning systems, where you go inside the system. There's this technique called adversarial training, where you actually make the model train in a way that it can make the decision without predicting the gender, or without predicting a demographics, or without predicting the zip code of that application, right? So make your decision without considering gender, without considering race, without considering location. So that's where the explainability starts helping. That's the stage one. And then the stage two tells you what to fix the system in what aspects.
Sure, yeah. So I wanted to say I agree with you pretty much. I think that, first of all, machines aren't going to start talking to each other and plotting anytime soon. If you asked me to draw one of these lines here, my line would be one of the lower ones. I think that we're pretty far away from this sort of technology, and we shouldn't be worried about it happening right now. As far as, what was this? I don't remember the name of the conference, but I can look it up and get back to you on that. As far as like safety is concerned, I think that the interpretability is actually one of the great areas of progress that can be made to try to figure this stuff out. I think that exactly for all the reasons you mentioned, if we get a lot better at understanding why the machines make the decisions that they do, that will be super helpful for making sure that these bad outcomes don't happen. So I think that what we need more of is this sort of research that you're doing.
I have a question. It starts with a wonderful preamble. Humans are responsible for global warming, deny climate change, deplete our resources, pollute our air and water, have the resources to feed and educate the world, but choose not to. Why do we think that AI should model human behavior? And then it goes another question that sort of speaks to the question of efficiency I had. How does AI determine efficiencies versus biases? We may be efficient, but isn't that based on preconceived biases? Can AI be self-limiting versus mind-expanding? So the question is, I guess, why in the world would we trust something made by humans? And is there a cautionary tale with technology? I mean, you can't fix the human condition before you break out new technologies. There's never been a point where we can say we fixed humanity. So what is it? What are the ethical concerns about pushing ahead when we have all the problems that we have? And like I said, some of our problems come from maximizing efficiency and maximizing profits, leading to things like depletion of resources and unfair distribution of wealth. Boy.
That seems like a question for the humanist.
Yeah, it does. We got two humanists. We got a historian and a philosopher, but you picked up the microphone, Jonas.
Well, so here's, I think, maybe an interesting way of thinking about that question of why if humans are so bad at making decisions to benefit humanity, why should we want this to be like humans? Well, what would, maybe you can tell me if this is wildly off base, but what if the AI system was just instructed, alleviate human suffering? Right? Don't necessarily do it the way that humans would do it, but alleviate human suffering, go, right? Well, one way to alleviate human suffering is to get rid of all humans, because then we wouldn't suffer anymore. So I would probably prefer a more human-based approach to that question than just a machine. Consider all options and pick the one that seems like the best way to optimize the outcome, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And also, I think one thing we are missing here to that answer would be, I think inclusion is the answer here, right? So if we include enough people in working and making decisions and designing AI, there will be a subgroup of people, right? Not all humans are pro climate change or pro pollution, right? Hopefully. So obviously a lot of
We
us
hope.
in this room are against all the things you said, right? Like climate, pollution and destroying the earth and all that. So I think there's a lot of push in our community on inclusion. Can we have, so there's, right now there's one of the most major machine learning conferences going on in Canada called NeurIPS. It used to be called NIPS, which is a weird word, so luckily we've changed the name. So it's the main machine learning conference with 10,000 or more attendees. The registration tickets of that conference go out in, I think this year in like 6 minutes. And then there's a black market just for attending the conference. So basically, there is a big push in, for example, there's this whole community on black in AI, right? So African American community and specifically people from Africa too, in big numbers coming to machine learning conferences. Similarly, other demographics, right? So basically, inclusion leads to this aspect where every aspect of human thinking is brought on the table, right? So then you can make sure that a certain group of people who are biased in a certain way are not making all the decisions that go into the AI system. So that's one very important aspect, right? And then there's also this whole aspect of thinking as a human. So then the whole philosophical question of ethics comes in, right? So I'm sure you've heard of this example of when you have an autonomous driving car, there's all these challenges that it's supposed to face, right? I think there's one where if an old person and a very young person are crossing the road and it has a choice of like killing one, like who would it choose? And then there's one about where it can like self-kill or like self-kill the passenger versus the pedestrian, right? So there's all these aspects that come in which most humans probably won't, there's no perfect answer, right? So then when it's truly philosophical or truly subjective or truly personal of a question, then obviously we cannot expect the average answer to go into the machine, right? Then there's this very interesting question of should each machine be different from other machines, right? Should there be some irrationality or some sort of personalization there?
It's the computers. They're on to us. They're on to us. Thank you, Mohit, for that answer. That was not a sign, by the way. I'm going to move into a little bit of a different area. I have a few questions. What we're trying to do is kind of look at all the questions you have and see if they speak to a common theme. And one of the ones that keeps coming up is the word China. So we have, please compare and contrast research and development of AI in China versus the United States. But also this question, please speak to the potential moral issues with the adoption of AI technology in the national security area, specifically with use in the military. China is ahead of the US in application in the military, and Russia would like to catch up. And then finally, a question regarding the recent Chinese scientists' use of genetic technology and CRISPR technology in new children. What control with the development of AI on an international level is possible? So this is a kind of a molding question about sort of competing with China, thinking about it as a national security issue, but then also thinking about what kind of international controls do we have, seeing as we were unable to stop this scientist from going ahead on his own and doing this genetic experiment. And I'm going to just say it's Peter that has to answer this question because he's our expert on Asian history. So.
Well, not to be an apologist for China, but it is not just China. I think these questions impact all of us, and these practices are fairly common everywhere. At UNC, for example, there are people in the biotech space who are identifying genetic markers in DNA for human behavior, and this gets you into very dicey territory as well, and they realize it and are very cautious proceeding forward. But if you find these markers in the DNA of people, what do you do about things like that? Markers for criminality, for example, or aggression. And this is a problem that we see all over the place. And many of the problems that we're kind of associating now with this recent case in China. Remember, we've seen somewhat similar things happen in South Korea and in Great Britain over the years with pushing the biotech envelope in various ways. So I think this is an international problem. There are 238 nations in the world, and about probably 50 of them have the capacity to deal in this space. And I think that China is one of many. And China has gone after this scientist as well. So I think, and China in some ways, for example, has been slower to adopt genetically modified organisms than has the United States, where in canola, in soy, in cotton, and in corn, it's pretty much universal now. So it's a problem for us all.
So on the international agreement question, so a lot of my work is actually focused on climate change, and we have there was after years and years of work, there was an international agreement around climate change, and then the election happened, and the United States promptly announced that it was pulling out. So not a lot of recent success stories on global treaties to deal with existential risk, where there may be, where each of the countries are being asked to sacrifice something, sacrifice economic gain. But I mean, if we think about artificial intelligence instead of a broad category of artificial intelligence, and think about the slide that I put up of all the different examples of the way that artificial intelligence may interact with our lives. I mean, we do have arms treaties. We do have treaties when countries recognize that it's in their mutual best interest to get together and agree to something. So if, from the national security perspective, if it becomes an arm race, or if we're talking about autonomous weapons systems, that to me, it's easier to imagine a discrete international agreement that is aimed at something, a threat that we all can understand, and to try to avoid it. I think the question of like the CRISPR analogy, so maybe it was a rogue scientist, maybe it was state-sponsored. We don't have much information about that. We don't even know if the babies actually even exist at this point. We just know there's a claim that they do. That's where, with this kind of technology that can take place in individual laboratories, again, in a way that is, from a regulatory perspective, international or national, that is dark, right? That is, it's hard to see it. That's where I think it gets to be much more difficult, and probably where hard law, kind of formal law, statute kind of law, is not going to be as effective as other types of governance, like industry standards. I mean, the fact that there was such an outcry from the scientific community engaged in CRISPR research when that happened, right? Because I think a lot of other people realize that if more news like that starts popping out, then CRISPR scientists lose the social license to experiment with CRISPR, then there's an incentive from the folks that are actually in the space to try to figure out how to govern it.
Okay. Daniel, did you have something to add about the ethical concerns? Or
Mostly just agreement. I think that, currently there seems to be something kind of like an arms race happening with AI. So China announced a national policy of becoming the world leader in AI by, I think, 2025, yeah. And then after China did that, a lot of other countries started announcing their national policy. Currently, a lot of countries seem to think that AI is wrapped up in their national security, wrapped up in their economic prospects, and honestly, they're kind of right. But I hope that we can sort of steer away from that. I hope that we can treat it like an arms control issue. I hope that we can work together with China rather than against them. Because if we're all competing with each other like this, then there's going to be lots of pressure to do it fast and deploy it fast, and I think that's going to be dangerous. One of the difficulties with this, of course, is that it's not like arms races in the sense that you can use AI for a lot of good things in addition to using it for fighting, right? So unlike with nuclear weapons or something, we can't, or biological weapons or chemical weapons, we can't just ban it, and we can't just restrict it, because then we'll all miss out on all the benefits that are going to come from it. So we need some much more complicated thing, I think, and I'm hoping that political scientists and international relations people and diplomats can work together to make that happen.
great. I have a question, or a series of questions. I'm going to try to put them together into a coherent question for the three of you. It's about education. I have certainly questions about what would you be doing as a high school student to prepare for college and a career that involves AI? Another question concerning considering that we have AI that can break down tasks into algorithms and code solutions. What CS AI education? What should that look like? Is AI the only reasonable field to specialize in? And then finally, this is my question. I'm a humanist. Where do the humanities fit in education and AI? So whoever wants to take on, maybe we'll start with, where can you learn, what should you do if you're young and interested in AI, and then a little bit more about the implications for education in general.
Okay, I guess we'll go in this order. Yeah, so definitely not the only reasonable field to work in. So just to answer that question first, but a very exciting and very important field to work in, right? Especially because if you want to take care of both the positive and negative aspects of it, like I said, inclusion is the key. So more people, more input, more opinions. Yeah, so one aspect is obviously look at my page, and I have this whole prospective student information page where I try to tell people what kinds of even online courses you can self-prepare with, and what kinds of skills are usually needed from, because I do work with some high school students, and I do work with a lot of undergrads. We have a lot of research papers and projects with undergrads, and then obviously most of our group is PhD students. I have around 11 PhD students, 4 or 5 undergrads, and a couple of master's students, and I work with 1 or 2 high school students. So the good news is that a lot of high schools now have machine learning in their curriculum. So if you're choosing high schools, maybe look for those high schools if they have that option. And in terms of, I guess the second part of the question was, how does education and humanities fit into AI? So like I was saying in the beginning of my presentation, that there is a lot of work in trying to merge machine learning and AI with education. So there's this whole area called, say, intelligent tutoring. So we collaborate with someone in that area so that we can use our automated dialogue models, or like conversational agents like Alexa, but the academic versions of those, to be able to use them for middle school, high school tutoring. So can we build automatic intelligent tutoring systems that can scale, right? Instead of having one teacher focus on one student, can we first scale some of the basic education for thousands of students who are not able to gain access to high schools or good middle schools? And then obviously there should be more human personalized education for more complex phenomena. We have things where we want to bring in our so we have models called automatic summarization models that can take hundreds of pages of text and automatically summarize them, simplify text, right? So we are working with, say, disability faculty to be able to deploy these for humans with disabilities. So there is definitely, and this is obviously not just like a lot of people in the US and internationally are looking at this. So there are full communities on AI and machine learning for education, AI and machine learning for healthcare, AI and machine learning for humanities. I get a lot of pings from our literature department or linguistics department and psychology, philosophy. We are working with Abigail C., who's our one of our deans for education, where we are trying to take automatic take all our course feedback, right? Students give evaluations on courses. Can we do machine learning on those to automatically figure out how to improve courses, how to automatically give feedback to students? So because our classes are becoming very, very large, right? In CS, for example, we have 1,000 sized classes now, the introduction to programming style classes. So we do need scale, but there has to be a hierarchical system where we can't just expect machines to teach everything, right? There should be some basics maybe that intelligent tutoring systems can handle, and then you get more personalized human instructors for the rest of it.
Well, I think as you've seen tonight, there are various aspects of the AI problem, and I think that we will, in the future, continue to see people approaching AI from an ethical perspective, a legal, a historical question, and bring some value to the table. Much of the research going forward, I think, with something that changes as rapidly as AI, which is a kind of wicked problem, as they talk about, that doesn't have any one final answer, I think will come about as a result of interdisciplinary teams where you have people from a variety of perspectives bringing to bear their own perspective and adding some value to a proximate answer that isn't any kind of final answer going forward. As you know, many of you, we've heard a lot about STEM for 2 decades now, but recently humanists have talked about STEAM, where you add the arts.
I got one more. STEAM, add the humanities in there too. It's a new Yiddish word.
Oh,
so
okay.
that's
And I wrote a piece a couple years ago. I had a rearranged the letters, but I called it themas, which got STEM plus arts and history into the equation. So I think that people have different skills, bring value to the table, and I think that AI is too important to be left solely to engineers.
Thank you. We had a question, interesting question. How do you see advances in AI intersecting with an aging population? That's the simple question as it's asked, but we might sort of extrapolate that on when I think about jobs and I think about care. We know that that's going to be a major part of our industries. We'll be caring for an aging population. It sort of dovetails back into education. It feels like it's unfair if high school students have all sorts of opportunities to sort of get ahead. So can you speak to older populations and AI, the accessibility and how it might interact with their lives? Anyone? Go ahead, Mohit. I think
I
you're
was
up.
just repeating the point about healthcare. So there's a lot of push on at NSF. There's proposals and funding for building AI tools for old age homes, right, where you can have personal assistants eventually walking around, or at least rolling around with cameras and with voice and dialogue capabilities that they can monitor the current situation and answer basic questions and maybe have input to all the signals if the patient has certain signal readings from different apparatus, right? So basically be able to predict when care is needed, preemptively call the human doctor. We are also building things like virtual therapists, like can we have AR, VR style glasses, like HoloLens with basically a voice agent inside those glasses that can help you exercise remotely because you can't have human therapists at your doorstep every minute you want them on a weekend. So there is a lot of use cases, definitely. On the second aspect of it, where you said did you mean like how they can learn about it?
Yeah, learn about it or become, so it doesn't feel like it's something that's sort of happening with younger generations and you're just sort of catching up and waiting for this new, it just feels like a lot of people assume that the younger generation is going to have a heads up on this and the older generation is going to be left behind.
So I'm not probably the expert on this. I feel like that might be just because of the usual trend that you go to college more, like you just learn more new things.
Generational angst in general, perhaps?
No, I meant like if younger folks are going to college more, they probably learn the newer technology more. But yeah, if someone is attending college later in life, I'm sure they should have definitely access to, like if someone, so I have a PhD student who is 45 years old, maybe so not that old, I guess, but in general, he's learning AI with me from scratch. I mean, that particular person already knew a bit about it. But I'm saying there's definitely, I've known cases where people become PhD students or go back to school and then they are actually there to learn all this new technology. So there's definitely no hiccup in if they want to do it. But yeah, maybe there should be more specific targeted programs for AI for different age groups.
I think on the question of AI and aging population, I think that's where it's one of the many places where we're going to have to really challenge our values. If we prioritize efficiency, it's easy to imagine insurance companies saying, an AI system is much cheaper than a human assistant, and therefore that's what we will fund, right? And if we don't also value choice and kind of some of the other elements that we think are important for humans, then we could end up with an elderly population that don't have choices about how they're getting their care or who or what they're interacting with. Like a lot of the things that we're talking about here, we've kind of the artificial intelligence conversations often seem to start with this inevitability stance, and then then the conversation flows from that. These are choices, right? We could choose to give elderly folks the choice to live at home, the choice whether they want to have a human or a machine or both, probably both interact with them. It may mean society has to pay more for that choice, but again, that's something that we could choose if we want to.
As kind of an older person myself, I'd like to take a little bit of an optimistic view about some of the possibilities of AI going forward, especially the use of big data for disease diagnosis, or perhaps the choosing of an optimal course of strategy in dealing with the disease, and certainly with medical care constituting 18% of GDP or whatever it does now, anything that could possibly help to rationalize paperwork and bring down the costs a little bit, I think might ultimately redound to the advantage of older people and younger people alike.
Yeah, just, and if I might, if I may, I wanted to add some concrete examples to exactly what he said, where I think I mentioned that there's a lot of work and very successful work recently on using machines to, for example, detect tumors and cancer directly with medical images, early onset of Alzheimer's, dementia. There is this whole line of work on using Twitter and all kinds of social media to predict I mean, this is nothing to do with age. Yeah, like flu outbreaks, suicidal nature, all sorts of things. And these are not examples that are just hype. Like some of these have been proven to be very accurate. And although also on the aspect of taking a bit more optimistic opinion on the job aspect, I think it could also lead to jobs where all the physical requirements of the jobs could be AI handled, especially the kind of robotics work that people are looking at, where then you would actually value the judgment and the usefulness of an old age person more, because now they just need to mostly focus on their judgments and their opinions and their human value as opposed to their physical and exertion value, right? Because then we can use more of their brain as opposed to their physical capabilities. So I feel like there's both coins, or both sides of the coin always. Like I think it will just create new kinds of jobs that make us use our cognitive capabilities more than our other capabilities, and which I still feel like AI will not be able to replace anytime soon. So we'll be relying on humans for that.
Daniel?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if I had to guess, I would say that it's probably going to be a good thing for the elderly, at least in the next couple decades, and probably forever. I just wanted to end on another speculative note, which is that if we sort of imagine AI getting better and better at helping us do science, better and better at curing diseases and helping us be healthy, eventually maybe aging will be stopped entirely. And that would be great for many people.
Okay, well, I have some questions that I haven't been able to get to, where many of them I've sort of put them together, but I'm going to end on a big question here, and this is a question that came ahead from someone who signed up. Is it currently possible, or do you foresee AI becoming self-conscious? If so, what were the consequences? What consequences would result? And I've sort of stretched that to this other question. If consciousness means identity, what does a computer identify as? Does it identify as a member of a nation? Does it identify as a human, and so therefore it's lined up with human values and humanity? And then the question that was asked to Daniel is, I wonder about the death of human values, cultures, social values, rather than the death of actual human beings. So in essence, we're talking about AI becoming conscious, assuming identity, and humans sort of becoming more reliant upon them, and maybe perhaps through the efficiency of machines becoming less human themselves by falling off with some of their values and these other aspects we're talking about. So it's a big question to end on. Daniel's jumping for it. The philosopher jumps right in.
The first thing I'll say is that I think that the importance of consciousness to AI is overrated. I think that a lot of people think about, well, what happens when they become conscious? What happens when they become self-aware? It doesn't seem to me like that's an important milestone. I mean, it is a milestone, which is important in some sense, but I think it's much more interesting and important to think about what happens when they start having as good of an understanding of the world as we do, right? When they start being able to do science as well as we can, when they start being able to plan a business as well as we can, when they start being able to plan a war as well as we can. Those sorts of things have nothing to do with consciousness, and I think those are the sorts of things that are more strategically relevant. As for consciousness itself, I mean, it's a philosophical debate about what exactly consciousness is and what it takes to have consciousness. And I honestly think that the debate is not going to be resolved in time for these systems to be developed. I think that even after these systems have been developed, there will still be people arguing about whether or not they're conscious. Even when they're walking, talking, doing everything that humans do, only better, there will still be those debates. And I think we got to have those debates because eventually it'll be a legal question. Eventually it'll be a question of, well, should they deserve rights or not? Should they be treated as property or not? And I think it's important for us to think about that now, but I think as far as considerations of strategic importance are concerned, like, for example, are we all going to die? Are we going to lose our jobs? For those sorts of questions, I don't think self-awareness makes much of a difference.
Any final thoughts or comments about the dearth of human values and the growth of AI consciousness?
Sure. So I guess one thing to think about is our society has become increasingly specialized. It's a truism in many ways, right? In some ways it's less specialized, right? It used to be sometimes people would have an entire job that was just like hitting a hammer on something on a conveyor belt. Now we've automated those jobs away, and so maybe in some sense people have a little bit broader jobs that they're doing. But I think one thing that we could think about along the lines of loss of human values is if we do end up continuing this trend of increasing specialization, where we end up in a situation where human beings do just one particular thing, or learn one particular worldview, or learn one particular set of skills, then there's a sense in which human values and what makes life worth living has been lost because it's been so compartmentalized. And I think that AI has the potential to accelerate that and continue that trend, but also the potential to reverse it. And I think it depends on how we handle it.
Thank you. Well, I would suggest to you folks, if you would like to inculcate some human values, you can go home and read some poetry or history and talk amongst yourselves. Let us thank our panelists, Mohit Bansal, Peter Koklanis, Jonas Monas, and Daniel Cocatello. Let's put our hands together for the GAA, doing wonderful work. Catherine Nichols, Marcy Lemore, Jack Ahern. It's been my pleasure hosting this, and we do have all the list of questions up here, and so we can try to find a way to get those distributed. I'm not sure if you'll get great answers to them, but they certainly are intriguing questions, and we thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you.